was quite a character. Grandma Keeler only finished school through the 8th grade. After that, she got a job to help the family's finances along. As she reached young adulthood, the United States was plunged into the Great Depression. She was born in 1908, so she would have been 24 when the Great Depression started, around there. She was born and raised in a railroad town. 2 of her brothers worked for the railroad. Her husband worked in the railroad office. When I met Granny Kay, she was a widow who had never learned how to drive. She ate meat right to the bone and gnawed out the marrow. I mean, she spent 20 minutes cleaning off her chicken bones to get all the meat off. She looked for dented cans while grocery shopping and haggled the price of each can down a few more cents, much to my mom's embarrassment sometimes. She checked with everyone when they were leaving the house to make sure that they had some cash in their pockets. You never left home without some money, and if you didn't have it, she made sure that you had some going out the door. Her backstory of coming up in poor times and going through the Great Depression shaped her day-to-day life and the way she approached things in many ways. This morning, we're going to begin to walk through the decades with the prophet Daniel. His backstory is key to understanding who he is and how he survived so well in exile. Daniel's challenging growing up years set him up for success. What are you and I doing with our backstory? Daniel was born into a nation in a political vice. To the north, the old political power of Assyria that had taken the northern kingdom of Israel into exile and had conquered most of the Middle East was being driven back by Babylon. All the gold that King Solomon had amassed early on in Israel's history as a nation and the trade that he brought into being meant that Judah was a very wealthy little kingdom, and they were now being eyed up by these countries as a place to get tribute, to get money, to get gold. And so Assyria first, and then Babylon demanded tribute from the nation of Judah. The prosperous Judah of 100 years earlier was being drained by the powers to the north. To the south, Egypt tried to reassert its old influence on the world. They were no longer the powerhouse of days gone by, but Pharaoh was still trying to stand up and tap into the riches and influence of Assyria and Babylon by force. Armies traveled up and down Judah's coast and battled across the valleys and mountains of Judah. The borders of Judah were often crossed by hostile forces or armies looking to exact tribute. They must have felt like the Ukraine just before Russia crossed into battle. The nation lived in such tension for years and years. Daniel and his friends grew up in this mess. To them, it was normal for bigger countries to seek tribute from smaller ones, and for smaller ones to survive by paying for their safety. God had blessed the nation of Judah with all of this gold back in the day, and now they were living out of this provision that God had made for them hundreds of years earlier. as they asked their parents about the Lord. All the nation's glory seemed to live in the past. If God was so great, they must have wondered, how come they, his people, seemed like the carpet of the Near East? Well, they found in their studies that the Lord had promised this sort of thing. God wanted to be Judah's only deity. They learned that God had defeated all of Egypt's idols and gods as they had been freed from slavery. They learned about the 10 Commandments and moves of the temple and sacrifice and holy living. They learned about Kings Solomon and David. They also learned about King Saul and Samson. If they lived up to their lineage, who would they choose to be in these waning days of Judah's existence? Would they be faithful like King David? Would they be living in fear like King Saul? What of our own nation? We're still home to the largest economy. Like Judah, we have money. Judah could have seen their primary value in their gold stores. Is that how we see our value in the United States today? What of our children and grandchildren who are growing up in these United States? What is normal for them, having lived through the first 22 years of the 21st century? Daniel, Hananiah, Meshach, and Azariah came of age in a very dysfunctional time for God's people. Not only was it out of whack politically, it was also a spiritual mess. King Josiah may have been related to Daniel and or his friends. We learn in 2 Kings 24 and Daniel 1 that the nobles and kings' relatives and priests were taken into exile. So Daniel and his friends may have been related to Josiah. As a young man of 16, King Josiah started to rebuild the temple. And as he rebuilt the temple, a book of the law was found. And Josiah began to read this book of the law, and he realized that the nation was very, very far away from where God wanted them to be. And so he started a massive reform. Over the next years of King Josiah's life, he cleaned out where other gods were worshipped. He ground to dust the high places and the idols and the Asherah poles. He took these big altars on high places that people were worshiping other gods, and he burned bones on them so that they could no longer be used. Anyone who was dedicated to a god besides the Lord, these priests of Asherah and Molech and Baal, were killed. And King Josiah gave out of his own stores so that they might celebrate the Passover. And it says in 2 Kings that this Passover was unlike any that had been during the era of the kings. Said it was like back in Samuel's time. So Josiah brought about a great conservative reform, and he rolled the situation in Judah back to Samuel's time, to the way things should be. King Josiah died at age 39, going out against Pharaoh of Egypt. He was killed in battle. And almost immediately, his great reforms began to roll back. The idols came out. The priests' descendants started to lead worship again. It was like Josiah had pushed down on the spiritual condition of the nation like a giant spring. And he said, no, it's going to be this way. It's going to be the way it's supposed to be. And when his tension on that spring came off, it sprang back with even more power. His great reform became the great falling away. And this is the time that Daniel and his friends were growing up and coming of age. Certainly we can see that likely Daniel and his parents were now on the losing side as paganism roared back into being. Daniel likely had friends that were very close to the Lord and followed the Lord, but also friends that were very far from the Lord and worshipped other gods. I imagine that Daniel was living in a very polarized society. And folks, in a lot of ways, were just trying to keep it together in a spiritual topsy-turvy land in which they lived. Daniel knew the power of political reform. He worshiped with his parents in the rebuilt temple that Josiah had brought into being. But he also walked by pagan statues being rebuilt. Male prostitutes once again walked the streets in worship of these gods. Political reform without spiritual heart change, he found, only pressurizes the next round of rebellion. Prohibition in our own country proved that very same point as the Roaring '20s took off in our own nation. Daniel and his friends were taken from this seething city by the army of Babylon. With the king's surrender, thousands of Jews were let off in chains while their homes were burned and looted behind them. Jeremiah was likely known to Daniel. He had predicted just such an outcome if Judah tried to resist the Lord's judgment. And now they were walking in his words. It was happening. When we lived in northern Michigan, we often traveled south to visit the ivory farm of Sarah's childhood. Not far from where we got off the highway sat a green water truck with a yellow smiley face painted on the back. When the kids were growing restless at the 3+ hour drive, we would encourage them to look for the smiley face truck. It sat as a happy landmark that the drive was soon to end and that the visit was soon to begin. All Daniel's happy landmarks were gone. In all likelihood, young Daniel would never see those happy landmarks again as he went off into exile. He was likely in his young or middle teen years. Piling 70 years of exile as declared by Jeremiah would make him mighty old to be able to return and see the land of his youth. Not long after arriving in Babylon, Daniel and friends were chosen for leadership training. They were pulled from the exiles and set up with other potentials from around the empire to receive 3 years of teaching and training in Babylonian customs, history, and government so they could serve the court of the emperor. Not only did they leave their happy landmarks, they were indoctrinated into the new land and culture to which they had been taken. Wow. These teens were handling stresses and challenges way beyond their years. I think that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah had grown up used to stress. It was natural for them to join their parents' prayers for strength, courage, and wisdom to know how to navigate a country that was coming apart. Their backstory made them used to stress. 2, they had learned how to interact with peers who believed very differently than they did without accepting their pagan beliefs. 3, they also learned who to trust. They accepted Jeremiah as a prophet from the Lord and chose to understand reality through the Torah and not through pagan ritual. Holding that understanding of reality helped them to evaluate the other ideas and customs they encountered in Judah and then in Babylon. Finally, they had made the Lord a large part of their everyday lives. We see this as Daniel and friends choose kosher eating over the emperor's diet. They had taken the commands of the Lord to the dinner table. This choice of the Lord over food was now too important to give up. It became a way to declare their faith in the one true God. Even in this, they did not beat the other young men over the head, but instead approached the commander with a test. When others asked them why they didn't eat the same, this gave them a chance to bring up the God of Israel and his commands. God was a part of who they were and how they acted. They wouldn't let this change while they were in exile. My kids are coming into adulthood in a society somewhat like Daniel's. Following the Lord and his ways has become more difficult in my lifetime. The worship of science to solve moral problems stands against the teaching of the Lord. The worship of government is no less as powerful in deceiving folks away from the truth. My young adults have learned to interact with peers who live out vastly different lifestyles from the one that we taught them. We taught them the lifestyle that we did because we believed it was the closest to what Jesus taught. My hope is that we can learn from Daniel. If our society slides into exile from the Lord and we lose our happy landmarks, can we persevere as they did? Daniel drew a line he didn't want to cross in his worship of the Lord. He and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah trusted that the Lord would bless them in their statement of faith. Where will my kids have to draw the line? Will they be able to trust that God will bless, even as they are misunderstood? When that blessing comes, will they be gracious about it? As we dig into the book of Daniel, we'll see 3 main sections defined by use of language. Chapter 1 and chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, the language of the Jews. Chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, the language of the Near East. As we unpack these 3 sections, we will find a pattern of hope for those who trust the God of Israel, even in the face of pagan beastliness. In Daniel's writing, we will see great acts of courage that resonate throughout the empire of Babylon. Will we see such acts of courage from our children and grandchildren in the near future? Commitment and courage cocooned in love for God and his creation. course, we just celebrated the greatest act of human courage. God the Son exiled himself from heaven to the fallen earth. He was fully indoctrinated into the lives of fallen humans, yet he never gave in to the evils that they taught him. In fact, he bravely said yes to trial, conviction, and death on a public cross. No fourth man joined him in the fiery furnace. No angel kept the lions' mouths shut. Jesus died for his understanding of God the Father with no one to help him. And yet, like Daniel, Jesus was vindicated. Jesus passed the test and now sits in the second seat of power in the whole universe. Courage and love personified, Jesus promised his first followers, and through them us as well, that he would never leave us or forsake us. Oh, I hope my kids got that from our home. I don't believe life is going to get morally easier. I wish it would. Unfortunately, what happened at the Buffalo Tops Friendly Market screams against such wishes. I remember working at Walmart before active shooter training, and I remember working at Walmart after it started. And unfortunately, it is so needed. No, we need to grab a hold of Jesus' promise and grab a hold of his power as we step into moral exile. Will we prosper as Daniel and his friends did? Will we live to see the end of this exile? I don't know, but he does.